Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're tackling Walt Disney today. You guys gave us some excerpts from a biography called Animated Man. Seems like there might be some interesting stuff in here about the man behind the myth.
Definitely, Disney's one of those figures everyone thinks they know. But there's a lot more to him than meets the eye. Like, did you know he was raised in a socialist household?
Wait, really? Walt Disney, the guy who built the ultimate American dream.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. His father, Elias, was a big supporter of Eugene Debs. That's a pretty far cry from the empire Walt ended up creating.
It really is. Makes you wonder how that upbringing might have shaped him. I mean, his brother described their childhood farm in Marceline as this idyllic place. Walt himself talked about it fondly, especially the apple orchard they had.
Right, but even with those happy memories, you can see the contrast. Elias was a strict socialist, very disciplined, but he also played the fiddle, entertained the family on Sundays. It's like this weird mix of discipline and creativity.
I can see how those early influences might have played a role in Walt's personality. That incredible work ethic, starting with his paper route as a kid. Maybe that came from his father. But then there's that risk-taking side, too. Like when he fudged his age to join the Red Cross during World War I.
He was only 16. Talk about ambition.
And that ambition took him to Kansas City, where he started his animation career.
Well, not quite. He worked at the Kansas City Film Ad Company first. That's where he learned about filmmaking, using cutout animation for commercials.
Oh, right. So he was already learning the ropes before Laugh-O-Gram.
Exactly. At Laugh-O-Gram, he and his team were making these modernized fairy tale cartoons, really pushing the boundaries of what animation could do.
I read they had this fun, almost goofy atmosphere, even staged mock Hollywood shoots on their roof. Hard to imagine that with the later image of Walt as this demanding perfectionist.
People change, right, especially after setbacks. Like when the studio went bankrupt. That must have been a huge blow for Walt, but Mary probably taught him some valuable lessons about business.
Maybe if Laugh-O-Gram hadn't failed, he wouldn't have been as driven to succeed in Hollywood.
Maybe not. Sometimes you need those setbacks to find your path. And for Walt, that path led him to the Alice comedies.
Those were the ones that mixed live action and animation, right?
Exactly. He was experimenting, pushing boundaries, but he wasn't totally satisfied. He thought the animation quality wasn't as good as some of the other popular cartoons, like Felix the Cat.
So even though they were successful, he wanted to be better. That competitive streak was already there.
Absolutely. He needed to prove himself, which is why he created Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, huge hit. But then came the contract dispute with Charles Minson. Walt lost control of his own character, which was devastating.
It's crazy to think that led to Mickey Mouse. Would he have even created Mickey if he hadn't lost Oswald?
Who knows? But that loss forced him to get even more creative. And he learned a crucial lesson about owning his creations, which shaped his whole business approach.
He wasn't going to let that happen again. Nope. And that's how Mickey Mouse was born. With Steamboat Willie, the first synchronized sound cartoon, he was way ahead of the competition. He knew audiences wanted something new, and he gave it to them. And the rest is, as they say, history.
Not quite. That was just the beginning. The success of Mickey Mouse gave Walt the resources to build his studio, hire more animators, and really start building the Disney empire.
But it wasn't just about business, was it? Walt was passionate about the art of animation itself. He wanted to make characters more lifelike, more expressive.
He was always pushing his animators to improve. He even created the sweat box, where they'd critique each other's work. Sounds pretty intense.
It does. I can see how it would lead to better animation, but it must create a lot of pressure.
Well, Walt was known for being demanding, but he was also passionate. And that drive led him to one of his biggest risks. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first full-length animated feature.
That's what's so amazing. He wasn't content with just success. He wanted to do things that had never been done before.
Snow White was a huge gamble. People thought he was crazy. They didn't think audiences would sit through a whole animated movie, especially during the Depression.
It was a huge undertaking, but it paid off. Snow White was a phenomenal success. It changed everything.
It proved that animation could tell complex stories and evoke real emotion. It made Walt Disney a visionary, a pioneer. It's amazing to think about how Snow White's success really shaped the Disney studio as we know it today. Like, it gave Walt the resources and the power to go after his vision in a big way.
It's like he leveled up in Hollywood. But I bet that success also brought a whole new set of challenges, especially for someone like Walt who was so hands-on.
Oh, absolutely. He was in charge of a much bigger studio now, hundreds of employees, and that meant he had to delegate. Which, for someone who liked to control everything, like Walt, that must have been tough.
You can almost see him struggling with that from then on. This back and forth between wanting to be in control, but also knowing he had to let go to keep growing. Like even with Snow White, he brought in outside help, right? To manage things. Didn't he actually hire a general manager?
Yeah, a guy named Dave Hand. But it didn't last. Walt just couldn't give up that much control. He had to be involved in every single creative decision, every tiny detail.
It really makes you wonder if that need to be in control helped him or hurt him. Did it make his films better, or did it stop other people from being creative?
That's a good question. And it's something that people who study Disney still argue about. I think it was probably a little of both. On one hand, Walt's attention to detail is what made those early Disney films so special. But then again, it's hard to imagine the studio changing and coming up with new ideas if he never let anyone else have a say.
It's like that classic problem for anyone who's creative and running a business.
Mhm.
How do you balance your own vision with letting the business grow? And for someone as driven as Walt, that must have been a constant struggle.
You can see it in the films he made after Snow White. They were all ambitious, but some were more successful than others. Pinocchio was amazing technically, but it didn't have the same magic as Snow White. Fantasia was this bold experiment that some people loved and some people hated.
And then you have Dumbo, which was a simpler story, but so emotional. It's interesting that even after Snow White was such a hit, Walt wasn't afraid to take risks. He didn't just want to make the same thing over and over again. Exactly. He was always searching for new ways to tell stories, new ways to use animation. And sometimes those risks didn't work out, but they definitely pushed animation forward.
And we can't forget about the other challenges he had, not just the creative stuff. This was the late 1930s, early 40s. The studio was getting bigger fast. And there were problems with the workers, even a strike in 1941.
That's right, and that whole time period gets kind of forgotten because of how successful those early films were. But it was a rough time for Walt in the studio. Lots of conflicts, pressure from the outside world, and then World War II. The studio even had to start making war propaganda films for a while.
It's weird to think about Walt Disney, the guy who made Mickey Mouse, making war films. But it shows how he could adapt, how he could change when he needed to. Exactly. He was a businessman just as much as he was an artist. He knew that sometimes you have to compromise to survive. But even then, he never forgot what was important: entertaining and inspiring people.
And it's so interesting how, while all this was happening in the world of animation, he was starting to get interested in other things too. He started making live-action films, documentaries, and nature films, like the True Life Adventure series.
You know, you can see that same curiosity that we talked about before, like with the paper routes. Walt was always learning, always looking for something new.
And it's like all those different interests were coming together around this time. The animation, the live action, and then his love of trains, which was getting pretty serious.
Right. He was building that elaborate train set at his home, the Carrollwood Pacific. It was more than just a hobby for him. It was like an obsession. Every detail was perfect, just like in his films.
It's kind of amazing to think that this personal project of his would eventually lead to Disneyland.
It's like that train set was the beginning of the happiest place on earth.
And you can see how those two worlds, film and trains, were merging in his live-action work too. He made Treasure Island in England, his first all-live-action movie, and then The Story of Robin Hood. He filmed that in Sherwood Forest. It's like he was making his fantasies real.
And he had that same attention to detail in his live-action films. He storyboarded every shot, which wasn't common back then. He wanted to have control over how the story looked, no matter what.
It shows how much he cared about telling those stories in the best way possible. And speaking of telling stories in a powerful way, there's nothing like Disneyland.
Disneyland was like the ultimate expression of everything Walt loved. It brought together his love of animation, his fascination with technology, his attention to detail, and his dream of creating a place where people could really escape into another world.
It was such a revolutionary idea. A place where you could walk into your favorite Disney movies and meet the characters. No one had ever done anything like it on that scale.
And it wasn't just about rides and attractions. Walt wanted you to feel like you were really there. He wanted everything to be perfect. From Main Street, USA to Fantasyland. He even got experts from all sorts of fields to help him make it happen. Architects, engineers, even people who studied plants.
It's like he was conducting a giant orchestra of creativity.
Exactly. And he was also a master at getting people excited. He used his TV show to give everyone a sneak peek of Disneyland, so by the time it opened, everyone couldn't wait to go.
Speaking of TV, that's another example of how Walt was always adapting and coming up with new ideas. He knew TV could reach tons of people, and he used it to make the Disney brand even bigger. and introduce his characters to a whole new audience.
He wasn't afraid to try new things. He even used his TV show to help pay for Disneyland, which was pretty smart.
It's like he was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. He was always thinking steps ahead.
And he was always pushing limits, both creatively and with technology. He wasn't content with just sitting back and enjoying Disneyland's success. He was already thinking about the next big thing.
And that next big thing was Epicot, his idea for a futuristic city. But before we get into that, it's important to remember that even with all the success, Walt still had problems to deal with. He still had to run a huge studio, and he was still figuring out how to balance his artistic vision with the demands of running a business.
Right, and people were starting to criticize him too. His political views were becoming more conservative, and that upset some of his fans. And some people thought his idea of America was too perfect, too idealized, especially with the civil rights movement happening at the same time.
It's important to acknowledge that criticism and remember that Walt, like everyone, was influenced by the time he lived in CI. But it's also important to remember how much he did for entertainment and how long his influence has lasted.
Absolutely. And I think what's really amazing about Walt is that even with all these challenges and problems in the world, he never forgot what he believed in. He still believed in imagination, in family, and in making the future better.
And you can see those beliefs in the films he made during this time, like Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians, and The Sword and the Stone. They all have that Disney magic, but they also have those timeless messages about good and evil, courage and kindness and hope.
And he was still trying new things with technology, like the Xerox process they used in 101 Dalmatians to make it look more stylized and graphic. It just shows that he never stopped innovating, never stopped trying to do new things with animation.
It's really incredible how much he did in his life. From those early cartoons to Disneyland to live action and TV, he was a true visionary, a force of nature who changed entertainment forever.
And the story isn't over. With Epcot and the Florida Project coming up, Walt was about to start a whole new chapter in his career, one that would push his vision and ambition even further.
We were talking about Walt's drive and how Epcot was like his next big thing. It's amazing to me that even after all he'd done, he still wanted more.
It's like it was just part of him, you know? He wasn't just trying to build another theme park. Epcot was going to be a real utopia, a city of the future.
It's hard to imagine. We think of Disney as entertainment, escape, but he was really trying to solve real problems with Epcot.
He loved the idea of garden cities, these communities that could take care of themselves and blend nature with city life. Walt saw Epicot as a chance to show off new technology, how to live sustainably, and design cities in a whole new way.
He even called it a prototype community of tomorrow, like a model for how we could live and work without hurting the environment.
It's so different from the image of Walt as the showman, right?
Yeah.
Here he was thinking about urban planning, transportation, even alternative energy.
It makes you think, if he'd lived longer, would that vision have come true? I mean, Epcot today is more of a theme park about world cultures and technology. It's cool, but not quite the utopian city he had in mind.
Yeah, it definitely changed over time. But
Agree,
even
yeah.
now, you can see some of Walt's original ideas, the focus on innovation, celebrating human achievement, the idea of people from all over the world coming together. Those all came from his first concept.
And then there's the Florida Project, which became Walt Disney World. That was another one of his huge ideas, a whole entertainment complex that would be way bigger than Disneyland.
Talk about ambitious. Multiple theme parks, hotels, golf courses, a whole planned community. It was like building a city from nothing. And he was doing it all while he was sick with lung cancer.
It's hard to imagine how much energy he had, even when he was so sick. He kept working until the very end, making sure his dream would become real.
It shows how much he loved his work. But maybe also he felt like he didn't have much time left. He put everything he had into those last few years, making sure his legacy would live on.
It's kind of sad, isn't it? Seeing his dreams finally happen, but knowing he wouldn't be there to see it all.
Walt Disney passed away on December 15th, 1966. Just a few weeks before his 66th birthday. The whole world felt the loss of such an important figure, but his impact on entertainment, on pop culture, on how we imagine things, it's huge.
Thinking back on everything we've talked about, it's clear that Walt Disney was a complicated guy, full of contradictions. He was demanding and wanted things his way, but he was also passionate and inspired people. He was a smart businessman, but also a dreamer who never stopped believing in magic.
He was definitely a man of his time, but he also helped shape that time. He challenged the way things were done, pushed boundaries, and changed how we experience entertainment.
He taught us to believe in the impossible, to use our imaginations, to never stop dreaming. And I think that's what people will remember most about him.
It's a legacy that keeps growing, inspiring new artists and dreamers. And that's probably the best way to remember the man who created Mickey Mouse.
Well said. It's been amazing taking this deep dive into Walt Disney's life and work. I hope you've enjoyed it.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep diving deep.